And just like that, Colombia now is 10% more expensive than it was a month ago. And if you are earning in a foreign currency like USD or pounds like me, you will notice this. And even though that is not a seismic shift in inflation over the course of even a year, over the course of a month, it's a pretty big deal. And so why is this happening? Well, before I get into it, I'm not a financial expert. I don't really know what I'm talking about. This is just my own take on this topic, so take it or leave it. Also, the Colombian peso fluctuates all of the time. Some months it's up 5%, other months it's down 5%, and so it bounces around a lot. And so if you are an expat, an immigrant living in Colombia and you're earning in a foreign currency, this is just part of the game. This is part of the process. You just have to accept that your dollars or your pounds or your euros or your yen or whatever it is will be bouncing around in value like it's on a bouncy castle at a kid's birthday party. So let's get into it. So I've got all my details on my phone here. So the current exchange rate for USD is 3,450 COP per 1 USD. And 1 year ago, it was 4,000 COP for 1 USD. So that is a 15% difference, 14.5% difference in 1 year. And in the last month alone, around 10%. So that is quite a big shift. And so let's just go a few points as to why this is happening. So the first point, and quite on topic, because Colombia basically just elected their new president yesterday in the elections, is that investors after the first round of voting saw a high chance of Esperillo winning the election. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he is the far right candidate. He's seen as very pro-business. He's very seen as investment friendly to Colombia. And so when he basically won the first round of voting to bring it on to the second round, that started to get priced into the COP. The value of the COP started to go up a lot compared to the US dollar and the euro, etc. And so yeah, investors are basically more optimistic about Colombia's economic future because El Tigre just beat Ivan Cepeda in the presidential elections here. So that's probably the first most on topic reason. It might not be the biggest reason. Point number two is probably the biggest reason, but this has definitely impacted the value of COP versus major currencies. But interestingly, the COP actually got stronger under Petro, who's a left-wing guy, interestingly, and so it kind of bucked the trend a little bit, because I think if you're looking at a 4-year view, you were getting almost 5,000 COP to the dollar in 2022, and obviously compared to now, it's a lot less. So the first reason is Colombia's presidential election, which happened just now. That has been priced in over the last month or so, and even Cepeda lost that, and Colombia now hopefully is going to have a more business-friendly and more investment-friendly environment for people to invest in the country, and that's why demand for COP has increased. Now, the second reason, this is probably the biggest reason for what I understand online, is that the USD, the US dollar, has actually just got weaker. It's not necessarily the Colombian peso, the COP, getting actually stronger against that. It's just the dollar getting weaker, it's losing its value. US are printing a lot of money, all that kind of stuff. As I said, I'm not an economist, I'm not a financial expert, so I don't really know what's going on. This is just my surface level analysis of the situation. But yeah, if you look at the USD versus other currencies, it's also weakened quite heavily against those two. So it's not just the USD COP kind of transaction which has been affected. The US dollar has been getting weaker over a period of time. So that contributes massively to the relative strength of the peso, because as demand for dollars goes down, then relatively speaking, the Colombian peso looks a little bit stronger compared to that. So now, before I get on to the third point, it has made me realize and question, is Colombia really that cheap, or is it just cheap for foreigners who are earning in stronger currencies? And I really think it's the latter. I think Colombia is quite an expensive country for Colombians earning in pesos. Obviously, there are wealthy people here, but the vast majority of people do not earn a lot of pesos to be enjoying their life, economically speaking, here. And so a lot of Colombia's value or relative value for foreigners looking to move here or looking to go on holiday here is basically tied up and wrapped up in the strength of the dollar, in the strength of the pound, because you can get thousands of pesos for your dollar, you can get thousands of pesos for your pound, and that's where the value of Colombia lies. And so if you look at general trends or historical trends, I think maybe 15 years ago, you were getting kind of 1,700 pesos for $1, which makes Colombia pretty expensive. Like in today's prices, that would make your coffee at Pergamino $4, maybe a little bit over $4. I mean, that's expensive for a coffee in Colombia to be paying $4. So it's an interesting part of the process, and it's made me realize that Colombia is really not that cheap. It's only cheap if you're earning in a foreign currency, and only if that foreign currency remains to be strong. Because let's say the US dollar tanked even more, the Colombian peso goes up even more, and you were getting 1,000 pesos for your dollar, living here really wouldn't feel that cheap. Everything would feel pretty expensive. As a foreigner living here, it has made me realize the last month or two that Colombia is really not that cheap, and has made me kind of reevaluate and reassess my perception of the country, my perception of how expensive things are here. I think overall it's a good thing as a foreigner living here to experience these currency fluctuations, because it gives you an idea of what is a good level of currency exchange. For example, when I was here this time last year, I was getting 5,500 pesos for my pound. So that was a pretty good deal, right? And now I'm getting 4,500 pesos to my pound. And so if I want to make any big purchase in Colombia, any big deals, let's say renovating my flat, or let's say just buying a bunch of pesos, I am not going to buy a bunch of pesos at 4,500. I'm going to wait until it gets north of 5,000 and then I'm going to pull the trigger then. So I think medium to long term, it is good to experience these currency fluctuations as a foreigner living here. But obviously in the short term, it's a little bit painful because it makes you realize that Colombia is really not that cheap. Okay, back to it. So the third point, Colombia just has high interest rates as well. I think the current interest rate level is 11.25%, which is actually a pretty attractive deal to investors because if you can just easily make 11.5% just keeping your money in a bank account in Colombia, and that's safe, or treasury bonds or whatever it is, why would you make the risk holding cash in the US where the interest rates are relatively low compared to that when you can just keep the money in Colombian pesos? And those interest rates are high because Colombia has high inflation right now, so the Colombian central bank is keeping those interest rates relatively high, which increases demand for pesos because you can easily just make 11.25%, or investors can make that holding pesos in a Colombian bank account and make pretty easy money that way. So that's the third point. High interest rates in Colombia strengthen the value of the peso, but over time, as inflation gets under control here, I'm sounding like an economist, I know, but I'm not, and the interest rates start to come down again, that's probably good for local Colombians because it means their mortgages will become cheaper, but it will reduce demand for pesos because investors will just choose other jurisdictions, other countries, other currencies to keep their money in and earn that kind of easy interest rate money. And the fourth point, so Colombia is a really big oil exporter. It exports a lot of oil, it exports a lot of coffee, and those two things have gone up in price a lot significantly over the last few months, especially with the Iran war, with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And so with higher oil prices, and Colombia is a big oil exporter, it's able to get more pesos for those. I think it is, even though oil is traded in US dollars. If any of you guys are actual economists or know much more about this than I do, then drop me a comment in below. But from my understanding, because Colombia is a big oil exporter, it's a big coffee exporter, and the value of those things go up, the price of those things go up, as like the inflation's high in those things, that increases demand for local Colombian pesos also. So those are the 4 points as to why it's been appreciating over the last few months, or specifically in the last month or so. But when will it stop? Well, I think a lot of the price appreciation tied to the election, tied to El Tigre winning, was already priced in after the first round of elections. So I don't think it potentially has much more to go in that regard. But you never know, it could continue to appreciate another 10%. You could get 3,000 pesos for your dollars, would make things another 10% more expensive. But as interest rates potentially come down in Colombia, when inflation starts to get under control, some are also predicting an economic slowdown in Colombia, which I'm not really sure could materialize if El Tigre comes into power and does all of these business and economically friendly investment policies, etc. So I'm not too sure about that. Yeah, it's pretty crazy how the Colombian peso has appreciated this much in the last month alone, but I still think it has a little bit more room to grow, because if you look at 5-year trends, if you look at 10-year trends, this is definitely not the strongest it's been, and potentially if you look at that, it has more room to go. But the one thing it has made me realize, as I've said, is Colombia really isn't that cheap. The cheapness of it and the relative affordability of it is all tied up in the strength of the dollar and the strength of the pound. And so as long as those currencies are still pretty strong, Colombia is going to feel cheap only if you are earning in those currencies. Or if you are not earning in those currencies, or those currencies get weaker over time, then Colombia is going to feel real expensive real soon. As you can see from the charts, it jumps around all the time. And so yeah, all the expats here who quote the prices in USD instead of local Colombian pesos will still start realizing that their menu del dia starts costing, $10, $15 instead of $5 like it did a few months ago or even a year ago. So guys, hope you found this video helpful. As I said, I'm not an economic expert. This is just my take on it, and we'll speak soon.